Now, the 2021 edition of the African Economic Conference has kicked off in Sal, which is an island in Cape Verde off the West African coast. The three-day meeting is being held both in person and virtually, and the event is jointly organized by the African Development Bank, the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, and the United Nations Development Program. Now, as those discussions kick off today, let's delve further into the key issues on the table with Dr. Antonio Pedro. He's a Deputy Executive Secretary of the Economic Commission for Africa. Great to have you with us on the show today, Dr. Pedro. Now, it has been said that the shock of COVID-19 has pretty much presented an opportunity for Africa to now put its financing strategies on a more sustainable footing going forward. Now, as we see this conference kicking off, are you confident, Dr. Pedro, that the discussions on the table will result in new strategies for a more resilient and sustainable recovery for the continent? What are some of the game-changing ideas and suggestions on the table?
Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak to CGTN Africa. First, I think we should say that ever since the pandemic frapped the continent and the rest of the world, we, the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, have been engaged in the conversations with the ministers of finance, economy, development planning, and other stakeholders in finding solutions to the crisis, to the double jeopardy that has befell the continent. I'm talking of double jeopardy because, as we all know, it was not only an impact or negative impact on the health systems, but also on the economy. And we entered in a vicious cycle in which, because the economy recovery was slow, the economy activity was slow, the resource streams were lower, our response to the pandemic, to the health impacts of pandemic, became compromised. So we've been looking at these solutions to say that this is not the first time that we're having these conversations. It started from the beginning. For example, as you know, Africa has had a very clear position on the issue of the special drawing rights. We have this unprecedented allocation of $650 billion for which Africa has only benefited 5%, and yet is the continent with the largest needs. So we've been arguing that we need more allocations of special drawing rights, for which, among other things, ECA and PIMCO launched the Liquidity and Sustainability Facility, the LSF, as an instrument to facilitate or to access to what is known as the inland SDRs, so that we can then mobilize private sector investment. We can lower the cost of financing of the continent. So these are some of the many other instruments that the continent is already deploying with a view to responding more effectively to the pandemic. But beyond that, overall, at a more, let's say, structural way, the continent is looking at building forward better, a greener continent, for which already we've seen countries looking at opportunities to utilizing their natural capital as a means to financing sustainable development. As you know, many of our countries, especially, for example, countries in the Congo Basin, provide significant ecological services to the rest of the world that regulate climate, which currently have not yet been monetized, meaning those services, the cost and the value of those services have not been taken into consideration as a source of potential financing. So we've been working together with the rest of the continent into first mainstreaming natural capital accounting in national accounts, so taking better account of the services associated with natural capital. And then the next step, as announced also during the COP26 is an effort towards establishing on the continent carbon credit markets,
Right.
in which some of those ecological, natural capital and its associated ecological services will be traded for green financing, for blue financing, so green and blue bonds. So there's quite a lot of innovative solutions that are being
Placed
discussed
on the
on the
table.
on
Well,
put
well, sorry to interrupt you, Dr. Pedro, because I wanted to drill further into the topic of development finances that are available for Africa, because we know currently Africa, it is still not bridging that financing gap that it needs to achieve the SDGs going forward, which of course are estimated at around $200 billion per year. So are the current developed finance sources that we're tapping to enough? You mentioned the special drawing rights. Does the development financing model require a rethink going forward? What is the solution when we look at that?
Absolutely. We need to look at an international financial architecture that responds better to the structural problems compounding economies such as those in Africa. An international finance architecture that is more responsive to the fragility that is associated, for example, with small island states, the vulnerability I meant. So currently, we don't have that, but I would argue that part of the solutions are also internal to the continent. Whilst we should continue to fight for a more just international financial systems, but we equally have to look internally and take the necessary steps with the view to first understanding what is the value proposition of each of our countries, in meaning what is it that differentiates our countries from other countries. For example, and I've mentioned this today in passing during my opening remarks, that we've organized from the 24th to the 26th of November in DRC, the DRC Africa Business Forum, where we went to a very clear and strong value proposition. Right. And this is based on the DRC's natural endowments of cobalt, copper, lithium, and other battery minerals. And the battery minerals market, as you know, is exploding because exactly of the transitions to greener economies, cleaner energies, the electrification of transport systems. Mm-hmm. This alone is going to be, by 2025, the battery and electric vehicle value chain will be about $8.8 trillion. And by 2050, this is going to be about $46 trillion. And the DRC produces 70% of the cobalt that is needed to produce the batteries that power these electric vehicles, and of course facilitates the deployment of clean energies, renewable energies, wind and solar. Right. So our argument was that, well, let's demonstrate that DRC is a globally competitive investment destination. Mm-hmm. So we've commissioned Bloomberg Nerve to do a study that has indeed demonstrated that producing battery precursors, or the chemicals that go into the production of batteries in DRC, is 3 times cheaper than in the United States, and in China, and in Poland is about 2 times cheaper than producing in Poland. Right. In addition, this study has demonstrated that the carbon profile, the carbon emissions of DRC are 25% cheaper lower than in China. Meaning, therefore, that that DRC is a globally competitive investment destination to attract investments for the transitions. And this is part of the changing the narrative. We need to demonstrate what is the value proposition, what are the comparative advantages of our countries, and then engage in the public-private partnerships, into serious conversations with business with a view to making sure that those opportunities are harnessed accordingly.
Well, Dr. Pedro, still on the subject of looking internally, we know that African governments were pretty hard hit by the pandemic. It exposed a lot of structural issues. Is there scope to improve regulatory responses as well, especially monetary policy models and instruments that we put in place? Are African governments willing and ready to go beyond beyond the beaten track, so to speak?
Absolutely. And again, I'm sorry to make reference and again to the DRC Africa Business Forum, because that was indeed part of the conversation. What is it that governments in Africa should do with a view to addressing some of the binding constraints to making their countries more competitive? And some of them, of course, have to do with the soft issues, the legal, regulatory frameworks, the fiscal policy, so that and so on. So we are very sure that in view of the importance of accelerating sustainable investments to the continent, our governments will respond accordingly. They are already doing a lot of this. Cape Verde, I mean, is one of the countries that is leading the reform process. Rwanda is equally, I mean, championing that. And of course, there are the Mauritius of this world, the Seychelles, and so on and so forth. So, but more of that is absolutely required. But this, again, needs to be done in close collaboration with the private sector, so that their needs and issues are part of the policy responses, and that the instruments that are deployed respond to the requirements of the society. So we are looking of not leaving no one behind. For example, we need to create space in the legal and regulatory framework for the emergence of competitive medium and small scale enterprises in Africa. Those are the ones that create more employment. Look at Germany. This is exactly the model in which a lot of the creativity, the employment is generated. And of course, in the context of Africa, the informal sector needs to be also part of the reform agenda.
Quite right.
How to formalize the sector, how to provide more support. We're looking at, for example, using foreign direct investment as an instrument to building a capacity of our small and medium enterprises through instruments like local content policies. But local content policies which are not designed by decree, local content policies that are that emerge as part of this continued dialogue between all of the stakeholders, private sector, the civil society, the small and medium enterprises accordingly. So it's about creating the right ecosystem. And we're already seeing this happening on the continent. So to say that, yeah,
well,
please,
sorry, Dr. Pedro, I am running out of time, but I cannot end this conversation without talking about debt and Africa's growing debt burden. It's a huge issue for the continent. As African nations emerge from this period that, of course, undermined development gains, left them in debt as well, how are stakeholders approaching the discussion around debt sustainability going forward?
Well, when we started this conversation, I've indicated, I've made reference to the efforts that we at ECA have been sort of championing to ensure that Africa would have common positions on some of those structural issues, including debt sustainability. So we've succeeded in ensuring that African countries could, their needs could be listened by institutions like the IMF that have created opportunities for that to be restructured, for moratoriums to be sort of in place with a view to creating more policies, a fiscal space for our countries to respond to the pandemic and to launch economic recovery. So more of that is required. It's a combination of several instruments. We also need, as part of the conversation, to mobilize to enhance domestic resource mobilization. So, I mean, today we've heard frequent references to the need to increase the tax base so that we modernizing the tax systems so that the pipeline of resources to fund our recovery are increased and expanded.
Right.
So it's a mix of solutions. That restructuring is part of it, but it's not the only one.
Right.
And I'm Mr. Pedro, not
Dr. Pedro. Well, thank you for correcting us on that. Thank you also for joining us on the show today, Mr. Antonio Pedro. That, of course, is Antonio Pedro, Deputy Executive Secretary at the Economic Commission for Africa.